From the nation's capital, the Conservative Caucus presents Conservative Roundtable, an in-depth look at today's most important issues.
Welcome to Conservative Roundtable. I'm Howard Phillips. We're very pleased to have as our guest for this broadcast Oleg Kalugin. Mr. Kalugin is now a professor at the Center of Counterintelligence and Security Studies in the Washington, D.C. area. He formerly served as a major general with the KGB. He left Russia in 1995 and has become a very popular commentator on American television and in the media generally in this country. Mr. Kalugin, thank you so much for coming.
That's a pleasure.
Let me begin by asking, why did you leave Russia in 1995?
Well, there was a very simple reason. I was involved in business, like thousands of my former colleagues from the KGB who retired or left the KGB in protest or in disgust after the collapse of the USSR. So I was in business, and I was involved with AT&T at some point. And I was very instrumental in opening up a joint venture with the Russian telecommunication company and AT&T. As a result, I was invited by AT&T to come to the United States and, well, help promote their business on the post-Soviet space, that is, in Russia and former republics of the USSR. My initial contract was for 3 years, and I thought I would go back. But then things started to change in Russia, and I got stuck here. Not that I regret, no, that's fine.
Tell me about your career as a young man. What kind of education did you have, and what led you into the KGB, and what did you do while you were there?
Well, I was born and raised in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. My father was a KGB officer, a junior captain. That was the highest rank he had. But I was a young and dedicated man, like most of my generation. It was still, Stalin was still alive. We had no doubts about the Soviet system. We were fully isolated from the outside world. And we grew and had faith in our system. So when I graduated from high school, I thought the best way to serve my country and the cause, the communist cause, would be to join the KGB. Partly my father's background helped, but also the general atmosphere in the country. Public service, a great cause to fight for and die for. So I joined on my own, and I applied. I had no problem with clearance because of my father's background. I was accepted to the Institute of Foreign Languages under the auspices of the KGB, and I studied English and German and Western history, civilization, other subjects. Later I was invited to the intelligence school in Moscow, and I studied Arabic, and I, in fact, was supposed to be an Arab specialist and go to Cairo after graduation from the intelligence school. But instead, I came to the United States as a Fulbright scholar in 1958, Columbia University School of Journalism. And that was the beginning of my intelligence career in the United States, and ever since I've been with the United States.
Now, when you became a Fulbright scholar, was it understood by those who sponsored you that you were active in the KGB?
Oh, if you mean the Russian side.
Yeah. No, on the American side.
No. We were all, I actually posed as a student of the University of Leningrad, the philological faculty. And in fact, I spent some time at the university to make my cover, more believable, right. So when we came to the United States, a group of 18, the first Soviet students ever to come to the United States after World War II. In the group of 18, 10 were officers of the intelligence services, 6 KGB, 4 GIU, military intelligence, 7 were co-optees of the KGB informants, and only 1 man was exempt from any affiliations, Mr. Yakovlev. He would later become known worldwide as an architect of perestroika, Mr. Gorbachev's right hand and the closest associates.
Do you believe that your American hosts had any awareness of your connection to the KGB?
No, none at the time. I was a bona fide, I tried my best. I studied well. As a matter of fact, the New York Times featured, my person in a Man in the News column and after my graduation from Columbia, and they talked about me as a true, Soviet student who wanted to learn more about the United States and how I was well accepted by the Americans and how I was good. Not a word, not a shade of.
This was in the 1950s?
1959, my graduation from Columbia. And, my first recruitment, by the way, of an American occurred also at that time, in 1959. He was a guy who had Russian background, but an American citizen with clearance, access to classified information, and he was a leftist.
So he was philosophically compatible.
Right, close, but he was sort of pro-Chinese. At that time, the Soviet-Chinese relations were already deteriorating, and he represented the Chinese wing. And I wonder how he got the job with a major U.S. company which was involved in the research and manufacture of solid fuel for missiles, And that's what I obtained from him, because I persuaded him, and I told him that the best way to contribute to the eventual triumph of communism is by making the USSR stronger. In the area of science and military. And that was his contribution. I said, if you are a true socialist, well, why don't you do something? Not just words, but deeds.
So what did you do in the 60s?
Well, I came back to the United States 7 months later as a Radio Moscow correspondent at the United Nations. That was another cover job. And in this capacity, I served in New York for the next 4 years. Now, in '64, I was recalled back to Moscow because of the defection of one of the KGB officers. And when dust settled down, and it was clear that I was not involved, and was not compromised, I went back to the United States, this time as a diplomat, just to make sure that I will have immunity from potential.
So you were in the Soviet embassy.
Right. So this is my third tour of duties at the Soviet embassy in Washington. On the 16th Street, press officer of the embassy of the USSR, right, and deputy chief of intelligence. Already I was some kind of a
deputy chief of intelligence for the mission or for the whole Soviet Union?
No, for the Washington KGB station.
Right opposite the National Geographic Society.
Yeah, absolutely, right. Next door to the University Club as well,
right,
and the Washington Post.
Right. How long did you do that?
Well, another 5 years. In this capacity, I served for the next 5 years, and in 1970, I was recalled back to Moscow, and because of, some good performance, I was promoted, became deputy chief of the directorate, and within the next 3 years, chief of the directorate of foreign counterintelligence, which was a major outfit in the Soviet intelligence. So for the next 10 years, I served at the center, at the headquarters.
Did you travel widely?
Oh yeah, I did. I traveled far and wide with the prime mission of inspection, so-called. Inspections mean looking after, see if our guys in Tokyo or in Morocco or wherever, that they do their job well. But also another reason, we were supposed to meet some assets. That was an instruction from our former boss, Andropov. He said, we must always stay in touch with realities of life. We must not become bureaucrats who would just, read books and cables. You have to work with people. So I met quite a few assets.
Was Africa of significance at that time?
Africa in the 60s and the 70s was a major battlefield, I would say, between the Western powers, the United States in particular, and the USSR. For the minds of the Africans, newly emerging states were really a battleground. We wanted them to be on our side. In some ways we succeeded. Ethiopia, Somalia, Ghana to a degree, Mali, Angola finally, Congo, it was split. Civil war. Lumumba was our man.
What was your connection with the Lumumba school?
Well, the Mumbai school was located in Moscow,
Right.
and I was operational outside the USSR. That was the difference. I was not involved in domestic affairs at all.
I have a friend, an ex-communist from what was Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, who was recruited by Joshua Nkomo and spent time at the Lumumba School and related to me some aspects of it.
Well, I do know that Lumumba School was one of the training grounds by the Soviet KGB, including and the military. They would select the guys who were, pliant enough to be willing to accept the Soviet, instructions and guidance, and then would turn them into agents.
This was in the 70s.
That's correct.
Before we go to our break, tell us a little bit about what you did in the 80s.
Well, in the 80s, something happened in between. In the late 70s, when one of my former assets was arrested by the KGB for alleged espionage as a CIA agent, I had a choice either to ignore the fact that he was arrested, so the hell with him, I was already a big shot, or stand up and defend the man, because I did not believe he was a CIA agent. And that cost me my career, because no one in 79 in his sound mind would challenge the justice of the KGB. I did.
Now, who was Brezhnev still in then?
Oh yeah, Brezhnev was still very much alive.
That was before Chernenko and
right. It was end of 79, and because of my insubordination of sorts, I was relieved of my duties in the intelligence service and reassigned to counterintelligence, domestic, in my native city, Leningrad.
We're going to have to stop there and take a break, and we're going to go into the very interesting next chapter in the life of our distinguished guest right after these messages. Please stay with us. Hi, I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus. I'm inviting you to learn more about the Conservative Caucus, a grassroots public policy action organization that was founded in 1974. Whether you're opposed to socialized medicine, interested in making Congress more accountable, stopping the New World Order, fighting gun control, reducing taxes, or restoring America to its biblical premises and constitutional boundaries, we're the organization you're looking for. Please call the number on your screen to get more information about our work.
For more information, write the Conservative Caucus, 450 Maple Avenue East, Vienna, Virginia, 22180, or call 703-938-9626. Here's how you can become a citizen lobbyist and influence how your representatives vote. Write a letter to your congressmen and senators. Speak out on a call-in talk radio program. Write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper, and call the Conservative Caucus for more information at 703-938-9626.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips. Our guest for this edition of Conservative Roundtable is former KGB Major General Oleg Kalugin. Mr. Kalugin, you've brought us up to the 1980s and the period when you reported to Yuri Andropov in the Soviet intelligence ministry. What happened then? What was the next step in your career?
Well, because of my insubordination, the fact that I decided to defend someone who was accused by the KGB, cost me my career. And I was reassigned to the domestic counterintelligence. It was Mr. Andropov's personal decision. But
so even though he had liked your work before...
He did like, but I was
He wanted to protect you, but there were limits to what he could do to protect you.
Absolutely. And I also aroused some displeasure, some of his immediate subordinates,
right.
Some senior officials. But I was not really mistreated. I was given a job of a number 2 man in Leningrad field office, which had almost 3,000 men under my command, and I had all the perks preserved. I was immediately elected a member of the regional party committee.
You were still Major General?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, everything was fine. In fact, Some people predicted that I will take over the Leningrad office and become the member of the Collegium of the KGB, and my future was very rosy. Well, I had my own suspicions about these things because I knew the true reason. People often did not understand why all of a sudden a successful officer is assigned to the provincial, though St. Petersburg is a great city,
Sure.
but still it's a province by all standards. But what made me a different man, truly, was my involvement in the Russian domestic affairs. For the first time, after nearly 25 years in the intelligence, I had to deal with my own people. Not Americans, not Germans, not Japanese. I would have to keep an eye on the Soviets who would not keep their mouths shut, who would say something which was unpleasant or critical of the Soviet system. And at that time, there was a growing criticism among the Russians because the Soviet leadership did not deliver what they had promised. And people were grumbling. There was a feeling of frustration, disillusionment, and the growing number of people who would want to become dissidents. So my job was to ferret out these dissidents and put them in jail or psychiatric institutions. This is something which I did not want to do. And at some point, I thought I made a major error in my life by choosing to become a KGB officer. Because I always thought that KGB is, espionage. I mean, intrigue, romance, great challenge, turning your potential enemies into your potential friends. I mean, a great job,
Sure.
right? Now I have to deal with the common folks who would simply grumbling and saying what they felt was wrong with the country. And this kind of a new experience made me simply think again about the Soviet system as a whole. By then, the Soviet economic performance was declining. The degradation of Brezhnev was too obvious. In the early 80s, before his death, he was really a walking corpse,
I remember.
The Politburo decisions were based on glorification of its own deeds, I mean, it was truly the duplicity of the system, the falsehoods, and the mistreatment of its own people. Well, I was not an exceptional case. There were millions of Russians who felt the same way. And it was Mr. Gorbachev, the party functionary, who felt the same way too. And when he came to power, he decided to overhaul the Soviet system because he felt that something went wrong and something had to be done. So I became immediately Mr. Gorbachev's admirer and supporter, at least at the initial stage, in 1985. Oh, no, I was still in Leningrad.
Yeah.
I watched him on television, and I met him only once when he came to Leningrad. That was in the summer of 85, I believe, soon after he was elevated to his position, and I simply followed him and his wife as a senior official of the KGB in the region. But I admired his courage, and I wanted a change, like millions of my countrymen, In fact, encouraged by Mr. Gorbachev's appeal to the Russians to do something in a new way, I wrote a letter to the Party Central Committee about corruption in Leningrad party and government organizations. And within 2 weeks, a commission arrived from Moscow to investigate me, not the facts, which I had provided. So to me, it was a reminder that Gorbachev may think one way, but his environment.
So you were a whistleblower, but the other guys controlled the whistles.
Absolutely right. So what I did next, I sat down and wrote a letter to Mr. Gorbachev in person. That was January of 1987. In that letter, I stated that the KGB has become a state within the state, and if Mr. Gorbachev does not destroy it, they will destroy him. That was the message. I also offered to restructure the Soviet society as a whole. It was a very loyal letter, loyal to Mr. Gorbachev and his reforms. And the letter was handed over to him by my good friend, Mr. Yakovlev, who was my sort of a colleague during Columbia University days in 1958-59. We remained friends.
So
and still friends
Gorbachev
are.
received the letter.
Right. Gorbachev received that letter from Mr. Yakovlev's hands. Before this happened, by the way, I gave the letter for Mr. Yakovlev to read. It was a 12-page letter, and I was not sure what Mr. Yakovlev's reaction will be, because he was a Politburo member, I mean, man next to Gorbachev. And I was truly nervous, jittery. I thought, Jesus, what if he says it's trash? Throw it away. And he read it, said, all correct, I'll give it to Gorbachev. So I was very pleased that I am not the only maverick, someone who has a special view. He also had the same view. And I say millions of Russians had similar views.
Did you get a reaction from Gorbachev?
Well, I was immediately recalled from Leningrad to Moscow. That was the first reaction. And I was put in charge of the Soviet Academy of Sciences Counterintelligence Division. So my job was now to look after the Soviet scientists and the, classified research and whatever they did. I had to keep an eye on that. It was purely internal security job. Later on, I was transferred to the Ministry of Electronic Industries with the same mission. And then, when I reached 55, I was summoned to the personnel department of the KGB, and they told me, Mr. Kalugin, you work so well. You're a good, great officer, but it's time for you to go. Had I been quiet and obedient servant of whoever is in charge, I could have served for another 10 years, because it's not mandatory age.
Sure.
I could stay on the job till 70 or 75. But anyway, they were sorry, and I said I'm happy, because I was already fully, prepared to leave. And the moment I got my ID card as a retired general, I went into the offices of the Russian Democratic Movement and introduced myself and said I wish to work for a change in Russia. So I sided with those who were opposing Gorbachev, who thought that Gorbachev was not doing enough, that he was
This was Yeltsin's movement?
it was, yes. Yeltsin was part of that movement.
Yeah.
That's correct. And then out of this KGB now, I felt free to, denounce my own organization. When I was inside, I wrote letters, as I explained, to the party officials, Gorbachev, Party Central Committee, but now I felt free to speak out. And I denounced the KGB. I said things which I had written Gorbachev, publicly. And the reaction followed almost immediately. Gorbachev issued a decree stripping me of my rank, decorations, and pension. That was 1990. And the military prosecutor launched an investigation charging me with leaking state secrets. Well, I would probably land in jail in the next few weeks or months, but the mood in the country was already absolutely uncontrollable, People wanted a change so badly that despite my background, as a KGB officer, I was elected by over 1 million people, a member of the Soviet legislature.
So they couldn't imprison
Supreme
you?
Soviet. No, I obtained immunity from prosecution. And that made me, a free man in a sense, because I could now travel abroad, I could speak whatever I wanted to say, and that was the beginning of my new career as a public figure.
We have to take a break. When we come back, I would like to get your analysis of Vladimir Putin. How did he become president? And what should we understand about him from an American perspective? We'll be right back after these messages.
Here's how you can become a citizen lobbyist and influence how your representatives vote. Write a letter to your congressmen and senators. Speak out on a call-in talk radio program. Write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper and call the Conservative Caucus for more information at 703-938-9626.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips with Oleg Kalugin. Oleg, we have just 2.5 minutes, and I want to get your assessment of why Putin was snatched from relative obscurity by Yeltsin to become his successor, and how should we as Americans in your view, evaluate Putin?
From what I know from my Moscow sources, Mr. Putin, when he was in charge of the FSB, Russian equivalent of the FBI, was tasked by Mr. Yeltsin with a very sensitive mission. At that time, the Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation, Mr. Skuratov, inadvertently leaked some stories related to Yeltsin's family corruption. Yeltsin was so furious, he did not know how to get rid of that Prosecutor General. He really compromised the president of the country. Well, it's against the constitution of the Russian Federation to kick the Prosecutor General by the presidential decree.
Separation of powers.
Absolutely. So he turned to Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin was the chief of the FSB, and he said, "Can you do the job?" And Putin said yes, because that was a character of Mr. Putin, to be loyal to those who picked him up, who made him what he was at the time, and he performed it,
Even if it meant circumventing the law and the
Absolutely
Constitution.
right.
We have just 1 minute. What happened then?
What happened that Mr. Putin organized, he framed the Prosecutor General. A couple of prostitutes were introduced to him. He was taken to a sauna and then videotaped. And within a week it was shown on Russian public television. The prosecutor's fate was sealed. He was...
Why are you here instead of in Russia? Is it because Mr. Putin has a grudge against you?
Well, it's not Mr. Putin's personal grudge, though we did have some exchanges in public. It's simply my unacceptance of what's happening in Russia. Mr. Putin's heart and soul belong to the Soviet system. But in his mind, he's young enough and smart enough to understand that Russia cannot go back economically. It has to integrate itself with the Western society.
So basically he is doing what he perceives to be essential to the interest of Russia.
Absolutely.
And making no gratuitous concessions.
No,
Thank you so much for being with us,
It was my
Oleg
pleasure.
Kalugin. Thanks for joining us on Conservative Roundtable.